The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. Part 7 of the Systems of Moral Philosophy. Section 3 of the different systems which have been formed concerning the principle of approbation. Chapter 3 of those systems which make sentiment the principle of approbation. Those systems which make sentiment the principle of approbation may be divided into two different classes. According to some, the principle of approbation is founded upon a sentiment of peculiar nature, upon a peculiar power of perception exerted by the mind at the view of certain actions or affections, some of which affecting this faculty in an agreeable or others in a disagreeable manner. The former are stamped with the characters of right, laudable, and virtuous, the latter with those of wrong, blamable, and vicious. This sentiment, being of a peculiar nature, distinct from every other, and the effect of a particular power of perception, they give it a particular name and call it a moral sense. According to others, in order to account for the principle of approbation, there is no occasion for supposing any new power of perception which had never been heard of before. Nature, they imagine, acts here, as in all other cases, with the strictest economy, and produces a multitude of effects from one and the same cause. And sympathy, a power which has always been taken notice of, and with which the mind is manifestly endowed, is, they think, sufficient to account for all the effects ascribed to this peculiar faculty. Dr. Hutcheson has been at great pains to prove that the principle of self-approbation was not founded on self-love. He had demonstrated, too, that it could not arise from any operation of reason. Nothing remained, he thought, but to suppose it a faculty of peculiar kind, with which nature had endowed the human mind, in order to produce this one particular and important effect. When self-love and reason were both excluded, it did not occur to him that there was any other known faculty of the mind which could in any respect answer this purpose. This new power of perception he called a moral sense, and supposed it to be somewhat analogous to the external senses, as the bodies around us, by affecting these in a certain manner, appear to possess the different qualities of sound, taste, odor, color, so the various affections of the human mind, by touching this particular faculty in a certain manner, appear to possess the different qualities of amiable and odious, of virtuous and vicious, of right and wrong. The various senses or powers of perception, from which the human mind derives all its simple ideas, were, according to this system, of two different kinds, of which the one were called the direct or antecedent, the other the reflex or consequent senses. The direct senses were those faculties from which the mind derived the perception of such species of things as did not presuppose the antecedent perception of any other. Thus sounds and colors were objects of the direct senses. To hear a sound or to see a color does not presuppose the antecedent perception of any other quality or object. The reflect or consequent senses, on the other hand, were those faculties from which the mind derived the perception of such species of things as presupposed the antecedent perception of some other. Thus harmony and beauty were the objects of the reflex senses. In order to perceive the harmony of a sound or the beauty of a color, we must first perceive the sound or the color. The moral sense was considered as a faculty of this kind, that faculty which Mr. Locke calls reflection, and from which he derived the simple ideas of the different passions and emotions of the human mind, was, according to Dr. Hutcheson, a direct internal sense. That faculty, again, by which we perceive the beauty or deformity, the virtue or vice, of those different passions and emotions, was a reflex internal sense. Dr. Hutcheson endeavored still further to support this doctrine, by showing that it was agreeable to the analogy of nature, and that the mind was endowed with a variety of other reflex senses exactly similar to the moral sense, such as a sense of beauty and deformity in external objects, a public sense, by which we sympathize with the happiness or misery of our fellow creatures, a sense of shame and honor, and a sense of ridicule. But notwithstanding all the pains which this ingenious philosopher has taken to prove that principle of approbation is founded in a peculiar power of perception, somewhat analogous to the external senses, There are some consequences which he acknowledges to follow from this doctrine, that will, perhaps, be regarded by many as a sufficient confutation of it. The qualities he allows, which belong to the objects of any sense, cannot, without the greatest absurdity, be ascribed to the sense itself. Whoever thought of calling the sense of seeing black or white, the sense of hearing loud or low, or the sense of tasting sweet or bitter, and, according to him, it is equally absurd to call our moral faculties virtuous or vicious, morally good or evil. These qualities belong to the objects of those faculties, not to the faculties themselves. If any man, therefore, was so absurdly constituted as to approve of cruelty and injustice as the highest virtues, and to disapprove of equity and humanity as the most pitiful vices, such a constitution of mind might indeed be regarded as inconvenient, both to the individual and to the society, and likewise as strange, surprising, and unnatural in itself, but it could not, without the greatest absurdity, be denominated vicious or morally evil. Yet if we saw any man shouting with admiration and applause at a barbarous and unmerited execution, which some insolent tyrant had ordered, we should not think we were guilty of any great absurdity in denominating this behavior vicious and morally evil in the highest degree, though it expressed nothing but depraved moral faculties or an absurd approbation of this horrid action, as of what was noble, magnanimous, and great. Our heart, I imagine, at the sight of such a spectator, would forget for a while its sympathy with the sufferer, and feel nothing but horror and detestation at the thought of so execrable a wretch. We should abominate him, even more than that tyrant who might be goaded on by the strong passions of jealousy, fear, and resentment, and upon that account of more excusable. But the sentiments of the spectator would appear altogether without cause or motive, and therefore most perfectly and completely detestable. There is no perversion of sentiment or affection which our heart would be more averse to enter into, or which it would reject with greater hatred and indignation, than one of this kind, and so far from regarding such a constitution of mind as being merely something strange or inconvenient, and not in any respect vicious or morally evil, we should rather consider it as the very last and most dreadful stage of moral depravity. Correct moral sentiments, on the contrary, naturally appear in some degree laudable and morally good. The man whose censure and applause are upon all occasions suited with the greatest accuracy to the value or unworthiness of the object, seems to deserve a degree, even of moral approbation. We admire the delicate precision of his moral sentiments. They lead our own judgments, and, upon account of their uncommon and surprising justness, they even excite our wonder and applause. We cannot, indeed, be always sure that the conduct of such a person would be in any respect correspondent to the precision and accuracy of his judgments concerning the conduct of others. Virtue requires habit and resolution of mind, as well as delicacy of sentiment, and, unfortunately, the former qualities are sometimes wanting, where the latter is in the greatest perfection. This disposition of mind, however, though it may sometimes be attended with imperfections, is incompatible with anything that is grossly criminal, and is the happiest foundation upon which the superstructure of perfect virtue can be built. There are many men who mean very well, and seriously purpose to do what they think their duty, who, notwithstanding, are disagreeable on account of the coarseness of their moral sentiments. It may be said, perhaps, that though principle of approbation is not founded upon any power of perception that is in any respect analogous to the external senses, it may still be founded upon a peculiar sentiment which answers this one particular purpose and no other. Approbation and disapprobation, it may be pretended, are certain feelings or emotions which arise in the mind upon the view of different characters and actions, and as resentment might be called a sense of injuries or gratitude, a sense of benefits, so these may very properly receive the name of a sense of right and wrong, or of a moral sense. But this account of things, though it may not be liable to the same objects with the foregoing, is exposed to others, which are equally unanswerable. First of all, whatever variations in particular emotion may undergo, it still preserves the general features which distinguish it to be an emotion of such a kind, and these general features are always more striking and remarkable than any variation which it may undergo in particular cases. Thus anger is an emotion of a particular kind, and accordingly its general features are always more distinguishable than all the variations it undergoes in particular cases. Anger against a man is no doubt somewhat different from anger against a woman, and that again from anger against a child. In each of those three cases the general passion of anger receives a different modification from the particular characters of its object, as may easily be observed by the attentive. But still the general features of the passion predominate in all the cases. To distinguish these requires no nice observation; a very delicate attention, on the contrary, is necessary to discover their variations. Everybody takes notice of the former, scarce anybody observes the latter. If approbation and disapprobation, therefore, were, like gratitude and resentment, emotions of a particular kind, distinct from every other, we should expect that in all variations which either of them might undergo, it would still retain the general features which mark it to be an emotion of such a particular kind, clear, plain, and easily distinguishable. But in fact it happens quite otherwise, if we attend to what we really feel when upon different occasions we either approve or disapprove. We shall find that our emotion in one case is often totally different from that in another, and that no common features can possibly be discovered between them. Thus the approbation with which we view a tender, delicate, and humane sentiment is quite different from that which we are struck by one that appears great, daring, and magnanimous. Our approbation of both may upon different occasions be perfect and entire, but we are softened by the one and we are elevated by the other, and there is no sort of resemblance between the emotions which they excite in us. But according to that system which I have been endeavoring to establish, this must necessarily be the case. As the emotions of the person whom we approve of are in those two cases quite opposite to one another, and as our approbation arises from sympathy with those opposite emotions, what we feel upon the one occasion can have no sort of resemblance to what we feel upon the other. But this could not happen if approbation consisted in a peculiar emotion which had nothing in common with the sentiments we approved of, but which arose at the view of those sentiments, like any other passion at the view of its proper object. The same thing holds true with regard to disapprobation. Our horror for cruelty has no sort of resemblance to our contempt for mean-spiritedness. It is quite a different species of discord, which we feel at the time of those two different vices, between our own minds and those of the person whose sentiments and behavior we consider. Secondly, I have already observed that not only the different passions or affections of the human mind, which are approved or disapproved of, appear morally good or evil, but that proper and improper approbation appear, to our natural senses, to be stamped with the same characters. I would ask, therefore, how it is that according to this system we approve or disapprove of proper or improper approbation. To this question there is, I imagine, but one reasonable answer, which can possibly be given. It must be said that when the approbation which our neighbor regards the conduct of a third person coincides with our own, we approve of his approbation and consider it as, in some measure, morally good, and that on the contrary when it does not coincide with our own sentiments we disapprove of it, and consider it as, in some measure, morally evil. It must be allowed, therefore, that at least in this one case the coincidence or opposition of sentiments between the observer and the person observed constitutes moral approbation or disapprobation. And if it does so in this one case, I would ask, why not in every other? Or to what purpose imagine a new power of perception in order to account for those sentiments? Against every account of the principle of approbation, which makes it depend upon a peculiar sentiment distinct from every other, I would object that it is strange that this sentiment, which Providence undoubtedly intended to be the governing principle of human nature, should hitherto have been so little taken notice of, as not to have got a name in any language. The word moral sense is of very late formation, and cannot yet be considered as making part of the English tongue. The word approbation has but within these few years been appropriated to denote peculiarly anything of this kind. In propriety of language, we approve of whatever is entirely to our satisfaction, of the form of a building, of the contrivance of a machine, of the flavor of a dish of meat. The word conscience does not immediately denote any moral faculty by which we approve or disapprove. Conscience supposes, indeed, the existence of some such faculty, and properly signifies our consciousness of having acted agreeably or contrary to its directions. When love, hatred, joy, sorrow, gratitude, resentment, with so many other passions, which are all supposed to be the subjects of this principle, have made themselves considerable enough to get titles to know them by, it is not surprising that the sovereign of them all should hitherto have been so little heeded. That, a few philosophers excepted, nobody has yet thought it worth while to bestow a name upon it. When we approve of any character or action, the sentiments which we feel are according to the foregoing system, derived from four sources, which are in some respects different from one another. First, we sympathize with the motives of the agent; secondly, we enter into the gratitude of those who receive the benefit of his actions; thirdly, we observe that his conduct has been agreeable to the general rules by which those two sympathies generally act; and last of all, when we consider such actions as making a part of a system of behavior which tends to promote the happiness either of the individual or of the society. They appear to derive a beauty from this utility, not unlike that which we ascribe to any well contrived machine. After deducting, in any one particular case, all that must be acknowledged to proceed from some one or other of these four principles, I shall be glad to know what remains, and I shall freely allow this overplus to be ascribed to a moral sense, or to any other peculiar faculty, provided anybody will ascertain precisely what this overplus is. It might be expected, perhaps, that if there was any such peculiar principle, such as this moral sense is supposed to be, we should feel it, in some particular cases, separated and detached from every other, as we often feel joy, sorrow, hope, and fear, pure and unmixed with any other emotion. This, however, I imagine, cannot even be pretended. I have never heard any instance alleged in which this principle could be said to exert itself alone and unmixed with sympathy or antipathy, with gratitude or resentment, with the perception of the agreement or disagreement of any action to an established rule, or last of all with that general taste for beauty and order which is excited by inanimated as well as by animated objects. There is another system which attempts to account for the origin of our moral sentiments from sympathy, distinct from that which I have been endeavoring to establish. It is that which places virtue in utility, and accounts for the pleasure with which the spectator surveys the utility of any quality from sympathy with the happiness of those who are affected by it. This sympathy is different both from that by which we enter into the motives of the agent, and from which by that we go along with the gratitude of the persons who are benefited by his actions. It is the same principle with that by which we approve of a well contrived machine, but no machine can be the object of either of those two last mentioned sympathies. I have already, in the fourth part of this discourse, given some account of this system.